Well, hello everybody. Here we are at the first Mind Science TV episode brought to you by the Mind Science Institute, which is a new entity. It's been around sort of working in the background for a few years, but what the Mind Science Institute is trying to do, and its intention, is to become a networking hub. There is so much information. There is so much going on. I think there's some we can contribute. But I think there's also an awful lot of connecting and engaging, which really is the central purpose of when we talk about the neuroscience and interpersonal neurobiology, which we will talk about in a moment. I'll have a series of guests, and today I have one of my best friends who, besides the fact she's my best friend, she's actually really terrific, Bonnie Badenoch. Now, Bonnie Badenoch is a practitioner and speaker and writer and editor and generally amazing person. Living in the Portland area in Oregon. It's all a bit confusing because she lives right sort of in Vancouver in Washington, which is like an hour from Vancouver in Canada. It gets very confusing for Australians. But, but we love her. And what we're going to talk to you today is about the work that Bonnie's been doing, and she's written a couple of really good books. I have one here, and we'll show you her other one in a little while, Being a Brain-Wise Therapist. It's been out for a few years. For those of you who I hope are joining us in Australia and Asia and over in Europe, this is something, it's just a must. You just must have this book to really understand how to engage the knowledge and put it into practice, which is, of course, the theme of the Mind Science Institute. So having given that introduction and said hello, I guess a quick one, I'm Richard Hill and I'm in Australia. I am a practitioner, so I do psychotherapy and counselling in Australia. I have a variety of degrees that have emerged out of listening to Dan Siegel and Lou Cozzolino talk about the neuroscience of psychotherapy. So I have a master's in arts in social ecology, a master's in education, and I'm just beginning a master's in mind and brain sciences at Sydney University, which is very exciting. So we'll kind of bring you all that stuff as we go along. I lecture around the world. That's where I got to know Bonnie, and I got to know Bonnie through interpersonal neurobiology, which we'll talk a little bit more in a minute. So for now, I want to open the conversation with my fabulous and gorgeous friend, Bonnie Badenoch. Hello.
Hello, Richard. Very nice to be here, even without an accent.
Yes. Who's got the best accent? Come on.
Oh, you do, no doubt.
Well, it was that wonderful time when I was talking about The Matrix to Dan Siegel, and he stopped me halfway through and said, "What are you talking about?" And I said, "The film, The Matrix." And he said, "Oh, The Matrix. I thought you were talking about a mattress." So I got to learn. So, but let's get into this because people are sitting there and everyone's time is a bit precious. There's a million things we can talk about, so I just want to direct it a little bit. But please, Bonnie, if you want to go in a direction, just take us off there. But let's just reflect for a minute on this sudden growth and movement and extension of neuroscience over the last 20 years. I mean, and in the last 5 years particularly, I know, mid-1990s, we had mirror neurons coming out, the polyvagal theory coming forward. And then it's really the last 5 6 years, it's taken an enormous grip and become a force in what's going on. So what do you think as someone who practices it both as an intellectual but also as an art?
Well, I think that, of course, with the new technologies, we suddenly became able to actually see what might be going on in the brain for the first time. And so that, of course, spurred great interest because none of us before that really could picture it. And so we had theories and ideas, but, everybody could go, well, that's just that, it doesn't really mean very much. So I think we've had all these gigabytes of information come out. And then people like Dan Siegel and Alan Shore and Lou Cozzolino have taken all of that, all pieces of that, the relevant pieces for therapeutic practice, for education, for the human arts, and brought them into theories. And then from there, I think what we're trying to do now, people like you and me who are in the trenches therapists and are using this stuff every day, are really wanting to illuminate the way that it might move from day to day, from session to session, from moment to moment in the session within the actual practice. And so really, I don't have any new ideas per se. I've been completely taken up with and interested in how to make therapy be the most effective that it can be, both for us as therapists so that there's less burnout and all of that, and certainly for our clients, how to support them and how the science can do that. And I've been doing that since about 2003, and really just have so much respect for the work of Siegel and Shore and the others and what it really can contribute in the counseling room. So that's why I do it. I'm a trauma therapist primarily, author and lecturer now, but I mean, I still, for 25 years, have been a trauma therapist. So I work with people that are really injured, and I can really see the value from a number of different angles that I know we'll get into, of
Yeah.
really taking the time to learn the neuroscience.
Yeah, I think it's interesting when you say that you haven't come up with any new ideas in the sense of direct research, of directly coming up with something. But what you, and certainly, and I suppose to some extent we can say this of Dan Siegel and Lou Cossolino as well, it's ideas about the ideas. And what's interesting to me is that ideas, these ideas are fairly disparate, they're fairly disconnected, and it's actually very similar to what we deal with when we're looking at someone who has a traumatic situation or has a difficulty in their emotional state, is we're looking at the barriers and the disconnections and or the disconnects, as we often call it. And I think that that's partly what's going on in the knowledge, and it's the practitioners who I think can be given some credit for creating ideas about the ideas, about the knowledge.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I know if you put, say, Dan Siegel and Alan Shore side by side, they're working out of the same knowledge body, and yet they're seeing the world through their own unique lens, and they provide support for different ways of practicing. And then maybe I'm a third strand, and Lou Cossolino is another strand, and so people are taking this core knowledge, and then I think out of, again, daily practice as well as a lot of reflection on the ideas, are finding different ways of talking about the application of it. And so I would say that probably the thing that I emphasize the most out of the neuroscience is attachment and attunement and presence of the therapist is the most important thing.
Yeah. Let's talk about that a little bit in relation to your work with trauma. And I've got a case that I've had recently, which is quite interesting. I'm looking forward to discussing it with you. It's sort of like it's nice to have all the other people out there, but wow, I get to have a supervising session with Bonnie Badenoch. Talk to us a little bit about the way you use this stuff and the way you work in the traumatic experience and the traumatic experience client.
Well, again, everyone's as individual as a fingerprint, so I think I have to start first always with respect for who they are as an individual, unique human being, so no two really look alike. But when anybody comes through the door, two things I can know from the neuroscience is that they bring an attachment system that wants to connect with me if I'm an empathic person. So they bring a great asset into the room when they come. They also bring a brain that's seeking to integrate, where the neural circuitry is always trying to move in the direction of integration, which is another tremendous asset that they bring into the room. And of course, I have the same thing.
Sorry to jump in there. Just a little bit more, just for some of those people, about clarification of this idea of integration. I mean, we talk about it in interpersonal neurobiology. It's like second language to us. But I wonder for some of those people sitting out there saying, I've got a client who's got this problem and that problem, and they're worried about this and they're worried about that, and there seem to be 20 different things. This integration is such an important issue. Speak, if you would, a little specifically about that.
Yeah, thank you for stopping me, actually, because I think you're right. You get so used to talking about this stuff, it just sort of rolls out, and then it's like, somebody else really might not know what the heck I'm talking about. So especially in traumatized clients, there's usually a major disconnect in neural circuitry in the right hemisphere between the amygdala, which is deep in the limbic system and holds a lot of the traumatic experience, and then the part of the brain that's right here behind the eyes, the orbital frontal cortex, and then the medial prefrontal that comes up in this area. And when those circuits aren't connected, what happens is that then our regulatory capacity, our capacity to slow ourselves down when we get overwhelmed, is very much hampered. Our capacity to be empathic to another, to attune to our children, our capacity to even have like a coherent story in our mind of past, present, and what the future might be. So many of these capacities are really diminished by this circuitry not being connected to each other, this orbital frontal and the amygdala. So the result for the traumatized client is that often these traumatic memories that are they're not located in the amygdala because there's a lot of other wiring, but they're amygdala-centric. That's kind of the core of it. When they really get up and running and take over the body, it feels like the trauma is happening right now, and then all of their responses follow along. And so one of our most important jobs as therapists, I believe, is to be able to really see that this disconnection is there, and then through our interpersonal presence, and certainly other things as well, but most of all through our presence in the room, begin to help them wire these two. If this is the hand model of the brain that Dan Siegel uses, and this is the amygdala, this is the orbital frontal here in the right, to help these connections begin to be made. And we can then begin to watch our clients become more regulated, begin to have greater choice in their lives, and so many other aspects that are just taken away when you have a severely traumatic history. So there's lots of other parts of the brain to be integrated too, but really I've come to really believe that quality of life has a lot to do with right hemisphere, amygdala, orbital frontal, medial, prefrontal connections. And then lots of other things can happen. But that's the core.
There's a massive complexity, absolutely. But that is enough. What I find is interesting, and I'm just starting to talk about it. You know, I'm writing, working on a new presentation of things that I'm calling the interplay, looking at this broader and wider aspect. But this really interesting thing that what we do as therapists, or what we have done as therapists, is we've looked at the indicators of problems. And so we look at behaviors, we look at emotional attitudes, we look at personality, we look at a whole bunch of different things. And what I find I'm beginning to see is that people are, the trauma, the problem, this disconnect and just looking at the disconnect between the limbic area and the prefrontal and the orbital, the medial and the orbital, the individual has a number of choices, sort of in a non-conscious way. They have a number of it can come out in their behavior, it can come out in their eating, it can come out in their immune system, it can come out in all kinds of different places. So you might have 10 clients all showing entirely different types of symptoms and expressions of their disturbance, and it might all come back that they all have this type of traumatic disconnect between the amygdala and the prefrontal and the medial prefrontal. So there's kind of like I think it actually encourages me that the system, what we do is more workable, rather than I'm trying to cure 50 different issues. I'm actually just working on a smaller number.
I think that's really true, and I think that as therapists, as we therapists learn more about the brain, a couple of things happen. One is because it does get a little more simple instead of just being this bewildering array of symptoms, we feel more solid, as we can really kind of picture the brain as a kind of solid, like we're on solid ground now. And then out of that, we can relax more, and then as we do that, our compassion broadens and our presence deepens. And that is, to me, the core of the healing environment, is being able to hold a fair amount of intensity coming from people in this calm, compassionate, non-judgmental, just sweet kind of way. And again, I think when we feel like we have our feet on solid ground and we don't feel so anxious, it becomes much more possible to provide that kind of environment. Out of all the years I've been doing this, I find I do less and less, and I be more and more. And then their brain finds a way, and they're able to bring in what they need, and then we work from there without me having to do the guiding, the choosing, the directing, or any of that. Just if that door is open for them, their brains respond.
Yes, some of the behaviors and some of the things that we face on the surface are sometimes very difficult to embrace. But to embrace the idea that we're engaging parts of the brain into a more cohesive experience that is going to be able to some degree, and to a very large degree, as we're now seeing in more experiments and more research, to actually repair itself. There's actually, it seems to be reasonable from a science point of view to say that the human brain prefers to be well and prefers to be integrated. I know there was actually quite a bit of argument about this some years ago, that the brain was just this messy thing that was held together by will and determination. But I think we're shifting that, and this is what I'm seeing in the research myself.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think that as we see that and as we embrace that as therapists, instead of seeing our clients come in as wounded birds without much going for them, just kind of broken people that we have to somehow glue together, instead we can see these amazingly resilient people who are hardwired to attach and hardwired to have their brains become more healthy and more whole. And so regardless of what's on the surface in behaviors or, like you're saying, emotional components or whatever that might be relationally, whatever that is, what we really can know is that they are bringing a lot, and that we can meet them on that ground because we also have our attachment systems engaged and our brains are seeking to integrate as well. And so it really becomes a two-person psychology of two human beings with the same drives inside, these same genetically wired in movements toward one another. I just find that really changes. And then, of course, if I see my client as essentially a very able, resilient person by virtue of this, I bring something entirely different to them than if I look at them and see a wounded bird.
See, you talk about this beautifully in the book, in the chapter that you talk about non-directive therapies, non-directive approaches. And what's quite fascinating is that many of the therapies that people do, I suppose when we talk about non-directive, there are some very directive ones, but even the directive ones, like some CBT and some of those, even those are non-directive. Because I think so, because they're working on the behaviours, they're working on the surface expressions, and actually what they do is they just distract and give a positive direction enough for the inner self, the inner work to go on. I actually had a lovely comment from a psychotherapist in New Orleans. He calls himself Dr. Mojo. He's kind of very New Orleansy. But I was writing to him talking about the interplay. And he wrote back and said, I love it. He says, inter instead of inner, and play instead of work. That when you do this sense of connection and engagement and just interact and engage, the inner work does it on its own. This point, I think, too, is very important in some of the types of therapies you use. And you talk about it nicely in the book, and I want to refer back to the book because that's where I want people to go after this. It's such a wonderful, wonderful book to go. Because you talk about Sandplay, you talk about art therapy, you also talk about mindfulness. But what you've also done is, since writing this wonderful book, second plug, important plug, is that you've actually written a book that takes it further into the therapeutic practice. And you've kind of given it a cute name as well. And now, I know we prearranged this. I hate all these people who say, surprise, you have one. But could you show us the cover of your other fabulous book?
Yeah. This was intended, it's called the Brain Savvy Therapist Workbook, and it was intended at first to be a workbook to go along with the other book, but so much had changed in the science and so much had changed within me from practicing for another 3 years after that one was completed that really it stands on its own. And it's the first 6 chapters are about the therapist working with another person, another therapist, another somebody to work on our own neurointegration, because to me, therapist mental health is an ethical obligation. And if we're not attending to that, we are not practicing in a fair way for our clients, because it's our brain patterns and structure and our ability to be present that's going to help wire up their brain. And if we're not attending to that, it really can be everything from neutral to harmful. So the first 6 chapters are about working on ourselves from this interpersonal neurobiology perspective, and then the next 6 are about how we do that with clients. And it's got a bunch of stuff in it that the first one didn't because so much had happened. I mean, so much happened so quickly, where there's a lot of the science that comes across my desk where it's like, it's not relevant therapeutically, so I'm not that interested. But boy, there have been so much that's been discovered in the last 5 years, last 3 years about changing these core, implicit, embodied right hemisphere memories and things like that, that couldn't have been in the first book because they weren't there. So,
Yes, we didn't
boy, there's just a lot that's of great therapeutic value going on, as well as a lot of stuff that's interesting but not, particularly applicable to what it is we do.
Well, this is part of the Mind Science Institute expression will be the Mind Science blog. So, I'm as you know, I'm a sort of a rabid investigator. I have
Yes.
200 or 300 things that come down into my email every day, and I sort of troll through those and pick out the half a dozen fascinating ones. And in fact, I can't wait to everything to get going because I found some great stuff yesterday, and there was actually something interesting this morning, but I was too busy because I had to get ready for Bonnie. So this is, I think, very important, a place where we can readily discuss these new developments and how it changes, to some degree changes, but also enables it to grow, what Ernie Rossi beautifully describes, growing at the edges. The
If I could just add something there just for a
Jump
second.
in. I was going to
It's a
push you
new path
forward towards
because
therapy.
what I have seen as I go out and talk to different groups is I get people practicing from so many different paradigms, everything from CBT to psychodynamics, psychoanalysts, psychiatrists, nurse practitioners, body workers, all kinds of folks. And what I see happening is particularly interpersonal neurobiology, because it's about how relationships change the brain, which is what all of those people are interested in, becomes like a kind of a campfire in the middle, and we can all pull our paradigms up to that campfire and look at them and say, wow, if I did this a little differently or this a little differently, I would be much more collaborating with the way the brain wants to heal. And so I think every paradigm can benefit if we are humble enough to not think we already have all the answers and really look at this thing I'm doing. Like I'm more in the psychodynamic long-term trauma field, and I have acquired such a deeper appreciation for the importance of regulating presence in the therapy room as a result of my study of interpersonal neurobiology. And it's changed the way I do some things. And I think it has created a much more respect in me for the pace of the client being their pace and not something I'm at all responsible for, that I need to flow with how they can go and where they can go. Sometimes slowing them down if they're going too fast, but never pushing. I mean, it just has deepened so much for me, and so, and actually changed some things that deepened others. So I hold out great hope that maybe we could all stop fighting with each other soon about my paradigm is better than your paradigm, and find
Yes,
a way to
I was.
draw on this common source of warmth and nourishment.
Well, I was fascinated because, as you know, my wife is a body worker, a research. She works in massage therapy, but she's also a researcher in pain and muscle pain and how that relates to inflammatory diseases. And yeah, I haven't told you she's just starting her PhD. So I'm doing a master's, she's doing a PhD. All we have in our house is papers, but it's a lot of fun.
Books, my goodness.
Yeah, we're crazy, but when I was at a conference, there were all kinds of practitioners in the room, hundreds of different practitioners, and the speaker at the front on the stage was talking about the this muscle, the supraspinatus and the radial this, and then we added something to such and such, and talking about the biology. And what I found is that it gave a conversation, a common conversational dialogue for everybody in the room, and they all were able to apply it to their own experience. And I also feel this is what's important in the neuroscience, because we talk about someone being upset, but that almost means different things to every different person. But when we talk about, I mean, now we can sort of say, oh, I think the amygdala's a bit fired up, and people are getting that. We've got one bit, but there's a whole bunch, and I'd love to be able to say someone saying, I think it's an amygdala issue, but actually I think it's more something to do with what's going on the periaqueductal grey because of the stimulation that's coming from there, which is a disturbance from the basal ganglia, particularly the putamen, because of, and that's gobbledygook at the moment. Your wonderful practice in sand therapy, and we may well have some sand therapists working with us. Can you give us some insight and some indications of, and maybe even you can hold some things up, but about when you're working with sand therapy, just that expression of the neural integrative work that's going on, that you see going on or feel going on at the same time?
Well, sure. Yeah, in fact, if I lean to the side a little bit, there's some of my figures on the shelf
Oh, that's
up there.
wonderful. Look at
Some
that.
of our figures, and um, I've been doing Sandplay since about 1993, and ran into it at a play therapy conference where I was just like the hair stood up on the back of my neck. Was this elderly nun was showing these pictures that some children had done of work in the sand and talking about their relief from trauma and all of that. So I'd been doing it for quite a while before I got into the neurobiology, and would see how much it provided a way particularly to express what can't be expressed in language, which is what happened to us in the first 0 to usually close to 5 years of age, because we don't have explicit memory where we can say this, this, and this until at least around 18 months to 24 months. So all of it's embodied experience prior to that. And explicit memory, even in healthy families, doesn't get solid till around 5. So we have so much within us, our whole attachment history, that literally cannot be spoken about. It has to find some other embodied way to make its way into the room. And so, of course, with all the figures and everything, they stir up, we get a resonance with them, and they stir up that symbolic embodied awareness. And so people, as they pick the figures and place them, usually don't have any words right when we finish, after they've created a scene, and we sit with it. But what they do feel is so much in their bodies, in their emotions. Sometimes they want to push the tray away. Sometimes they almost want to crawl into the tray. There's this behavioral impulse. And these are all of the embodied experiences that they now have the ability to express and sometimes find words for. And then together, in an interpersonal warmth and a potential attachment experience, we can hold together what they have created and get to some things that you can't get to through words.
And all these things that you're talking about, the embodiment, the feelings, the felt sense, they all have neurological relationships, because as my favorite sort of quick joke is the ancient experienced acupuncturist who when he put the man had a headache, so he put a needle in his wrist, and when he said I've got a backache, he put a needle in his toe. And when the inexperienced person said, that's amazing, you put needles in these strange places, and that seems to help me. And the wise old Asian acupuncturist says, what, you're crazy? Look, it's all connected.
Exactly.
And for everything that goes on in the body, there's a conversation in the brain.
Mm-hmm. Much more in the right hemisphere, because the integrated map of the body is in the right hemisphere. So whenever we're having a bodily experience, there's some contact with the right hemisphere. Emotionality, relational experience, all of those things are right hemisphere centric. And while there's some poetic language in the right hemisphere, it isn't that kind of discursive language where we can say this and then this and then this and then this happens. It's not like that. And so we wind up then with not being able to not only not access it, but even if we have a felt sense of it, it's not easy to express. And so by bringing it out in sand or in art, and then also just in the quality of the relationship between the two people in the room, is the main way these early attachment experiences, which are what interest me the most, because well, that's another whole conversation, Richard.
It
About
absolutely is.
attachment, because these early wirings when we were with our parents put this core structure into our brain that really isn't going to go anywhere in our lifetime without a lot of work. And so it underlies so much of what goes on into adulthood. But we know now those things can change in really remarkable ways. That it's
Yeah, I mean, well, here's just this interesting thing that as a point to bring up, which I think people might find very interesting, is that the early attachment issues very often lead to disturbance and traumatic and difficulties in later life that are very upsetting and very concerning. And I know that you've dealt and you know, held both figuratively you know, and in the work you do, holding the mind and the brain and engaging and encouraging. But one of the interesting things that I've found in some of the cases that I've had coming to see me, and I'm sure you have as well, that we don't talk about so much because it's not as dramatic, is that actually the dissociation and disconnection that occurs actually creates people who don't feel and they don't relate and they don't connect and they don't actually feel as though there's anything wrong. They just are incredibly shallow or incredibly disconnected when it comes to engaging with other human beings. Point which is quite interesting with this client is that there's an area a little bit further back in the head, the temporoparietal junction, which is to do with theory of mind and the way we think about the way other people think. And this is one of the places that is a fabulous point of defense in early trauma and very negative attachments. Because if we just don't think about other people and how other people think, and how what they're trying to say and what they're trying to do, we protect ourselves from ongoing attack. And I've got this lovely client, and you'll be pleased to know that we're actually, she's learning how to think about how other people think. So the brain is regrowing itself, and she's becoming more sensitive, which now, you know, brings in new problems because we're going to have to help her to deal with how to deal with emotions.
Yeah, there's all kinds of ways to, if you could really think about it, to disassociate one set of neural nets from another. I mean, there are kinds of dissociation where we don't remember what happened at all. We have no explicit memory. It's all embodied even when things happen later. So that's one way to dissociate, but what you're talking about is a dissociation between the emotional content and the explicit content. So the person can say, well, I know these things happened to me, but at the same time feel nothing about it, even when they're narrating the most heart-rending experience. Because like you're saying, to protect themselves, they've simply kept those sets of experiences apart from one another. And it can produce shallowness, but I also find it can also produce a lot of sorrow for people often because they have so much difficulty relating to others that when they come into therapy, it's like, I've lost 4 or 5 relationships and I don't understand because I think I'm a good person. And I don't understand why people go away. And of course they go away because they're not having the experience of having any resonance with this person, any felt sense of connectedness. But it's just very sad. And like you're saying, they're not experiencing necessarily a lot of discomfort beyond this kind of puzzlement, like, why doesn't anybody want to be around me for very long?
And that's exactly what my young client was feeling. But it's terrific. She's even got a boyfriend now. It's really cool. Well,
Hey,
one that she likes. You know,
yeah.
it's very exciting. She's
Wonderful.
gone. She did spontaneous art therapy work with me. She just appeared with these paintings and they were terrible, you know, slashes and things. And a few weeks ago, she brought in a rainbow. And you know, we're on the way. We're on the way. All this coming from the heart, or what we really talk about in interpersonal neurobiology is the right brain relationship and relating, and that's what's so beautiful about the work we do.
For us as well. I mean, it's beautiful for us because as we work with others, our brains are integrating too. When we're in these empathic relationships, it flows both ways. And since it is truly a two-person psychology, I have a friend that says that she would never say this to her clients, but that each new client has a little bit better therapist than the last one because the previous client has been busy, you know, integrating her brain.
Oh yeah, it's wonderful work to do, and I find it so much easier to work with the traumas, with the difficulties, with the struggles, with the things that are very ugly and unpleasant and uncomfortable and disturbing when I work, when the work I'm doing is on the brain and is on the relationship and the benefit and the value, because sometimes the client is a difficult thing. but their brain is always something that can be regrown and remodeled and reattached and re-engaged.
Well, right, and I have found it's really helpful for my clients for them to understand their brains, because
Mm.
then they begin to develop the capacity to watch their own mental functioning, and they can come in and say, feel like I have knots in my amygdala today, or I'm really aware that what's going on in my right isn't connected to my left. Can we work in that area? And so what they're being
Just
able to do is basically stand back and get a little bit of a look at their brain, and that already is growing some of this circuitry between the prefrontal region and the amygdala, the limbic region, just by virtue of them having a little bit of a different ability to look at their own self, to have this, what Dan Siegel would call some mind sight on their own functioning.
yes.
So it helps us be better therapists to be able to see more deeply, but it really helps them as well to be able to look at themselves, you know.
Yeah, it's very exciting, and the whole nature of the fact that the people have been used to this with their bodies. I mean, we sort of say, I got a pain in my leg, got a pain here. We kind of know, oh, and as we get a bit wiser, we say, oh, my knee's acting up, but actually I know that that's because I've got something wrong with my hip. We learn a lot about our bodies, and now it's time to learn about our brains, I think,
Yeah, I
and it's
think
an
so
exciting
too.
time. So I'm looking forward to continuing this work. We hope to have, I know you do quite a lot of study groups around the place, and that's a third arm of the Mind Science Institute, and we'll do them both face-to-face for those people in Sydney, but also over the web. And I believe you do one over the web now.
Yeah, we do them on the web and some others that we record on teleconferencing and all kinds of different ways, but it's really helpful for small groups to gather and go over this week after week and really begin in the context of particular clients to see, oh, that's what's happening here. It's really useful,
Yeah.
really useful. So I'm glad you're doing
Because
that.
yeah, well, I think that's exciting, and we can get some different aspects, and maybe we can all sort of interrelate, become interpersonal, and share with each other. I mean, there's always a certain amount of protection, and that builds up around commercial activities. But I wonder if we can figure out how to change the system and interact and integrate and share, and still manage to be able to put food on the table. It's an exciting time, I think, and
Yes.
boy, am I glad I met you. I tell you.
Well, I'm glad I met you too. We've had some good times writing together and everything, haven't we? Thank you so much for inviting me, Richard. I really appreciate it.
It's my great pleasure, and to everybody, from everybody out there who's looking in here, I think they'll say thank you very much for sharing your knowledge and wisdom. Thanks,
My
Bonnie.
pleasure. Mhm.